Welcome back to our discussion and exploration of Islamic intellectual history. In our previous segment, we explored the concept of thing or a shay as the genus of all entities possessing the property of being like or unlike. Today, we continue this philosophical and theological inquiry by examining the unique and radical position of Jahm ibn Ṣafwān and his followers who challenged traditional understandings by denying even the application of thingness to God. And in this segment, we unpack Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's ontology, his reinterpretation of the Quranic verse, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, and how his views were situated in the broader Kalam debates on God's nature, being, and knowability. From claims that God is beyond likeness, composition, and even intellectual perception, to his rejection of all sifat as distinct from the divine essence, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's doctrine marked the turning point in Islamic theological history, provoking sharp responses from Hanabalites and others. So stay with us as we go through this dense but highly important terrain in the development of Islamic thought. From the early days of Islamic theological disputes, dialectics of the Kalam, scholars debated the unity of the wahdaniyah and the simplicity of the basata of God, affirming that He is incorporeal, la jisma lahu, incomposite, la tarkiba fi, without extension or intensity, la bast wa la intishara fi, inoriginate, ghayr muhdath, and without place or dimensions, la makana lah wa la miqdara lah. And these discussions often reference the Quranic verse, laysa kamithlihi shay. Nothing is like something like Him. Taken literally, this phrase seems paradoxical. It affirms that there exists something like God, shay'un mithlullah, while negating that there is anything or any shay that resembles what is like God. Most Muslim scholars interpret it like something like kamithlihi is an intensifying pleonasm or the tawqeed, and instead the verse to mean that nothing at all like Him, laysa shayyun kahu. They rejected any degree of likeness or the mumathala to God, consistent with the classical theological positions taken by al-Razi and al-Tabri. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān read the verse differently, emphasizing that the term thing or the shay doesn't apply to God. He resonated that everything is like something like itself. لِأَنَّ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ فَإِنَّهُ مِثْلٌ لِمِثْلِ نَفْسِهِ. And therefore, nothing is like something like Him. لَيْسَ مِثْلَ مِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. And this logically requires that God is not called thing. لَا يُسَمَّ اللَّهُ شَيْئًا. And according to him, to be a thing is to share the property of likeness or the mumathala. A thing is always either like, mithl, or unlike, ghayru mithl, something else. For example, a dead thing is like another dead thing, but unlike a living thing. So the likeness of the mumathala is an inseparable accident, or the ardun lazim of a shay, of a thing, and which means the term thing or a shay denotes the most general class of the compounded properties, murakkabun min as-sifat. A thing, a shay, is that which cannot be divided, qabilun lit-taqsim, or induced, or qabilun lil-istiqra. These theological methods were also used by Arians to argue against the idea that God can be a common property, or the kulliyun mushtarak of the God the Father and God the Son. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's ontology holds that each thing exists when it exists as an existent body, or the jism mawjood. And the terms existent, or the mawjood, and the body, the jism, are the two different descriptions, or wasfaini mukhtalifain, are the predication of a thing. Existent, the mawjood, and the corporeal, or the jismi, are inseparable accident, or the a'raz lazima of a thing. So God, according to the Jahmite, exists outside the realm of all things that possess the property of being like or unlike other things. Since God doesn't share in the property of thingness, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's followers used negating descriptions of the asma salabiyya for him, such as non-body, ghayr al-jism, or a thing unlike all things, shayyun la kal-ashya. And in the Aristotelian tradition, such terms are called the infinite names, or al-asma al-ghayr muhassala. And according to Jahm ibn Ṣafwān, there are three oppositions, or the azdad of thing: the non-existent, or al-ma'doom, that which doesn't exist, laysa bi mawjood; the non-thing, al-la shay, a thing unlike all things, or the shay la kal-ashya, an existent that lacks the property of the likeness, or the mawjoodun biduni mumathala. are the non-body, غير الجسم, that which is incomposite or غير مركب. The opposition between thing, shay, or existent body, جسم موجود, non-thing and non-body or غير الجسم was the core doctrine for which Hanabalites and the Neo-Hanabalites accused the Jahamites of heresy, zandaqa, or infidelity, the kufr. And this was because Jahm ibn Ṣafwān denied that the God could be described with the attributes or the sifat, which contradicted the traditionalist theological views. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān argued that everything that exists is a body or is a jism. He held that the movement itself is a body and that it's impossible for movement to be anything other than a body. He justified this by stating that anything that is not a body, غير الجسم, is God, and since God is unique, nothing can resemble him. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān maintained that the moment is a body and this is impossible, that it is something other than a body, and تكون غير الجسم, because that which is other than the body or the غير الجسم is God, and there is nothing resembling him. لا يكون شيء يشبهه. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's belief that all properties are corporeal has been compared to the philosophy of the Stoics, who also saw qualities as corporeal. However, the Stoics didn't deny the existence of immaterial entities other than the God. In their system, the term shay, or the thing, included both corporeal and incorporeal entities. In their system, the term shay included both corporeal and incorporeal entities. And in contrast, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān made a strict distinction between the corporeal things, or the ashya jismiya, things that exist and are composed of parts, and non-things, or غير الأشياء, things are not corporeal, such as God. For Jahm ibn Ṣafwān, the fundamental opposition was between the existent bodies and everything that is not a body, which made his ontology quite different from his Stoic thought. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān and his followers interpreted the Quranic verse لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ differently than the most scholars did. They understood it to mean that nothing is even like something that is like God, reinforcing their belief that the God is beyond all comparison. When people ask them about the meaning of nothing at all is like him, or لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, they say that nothing of all things is like to something like him. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ مِنَ الْأَشْيَاءِ. He cannot be described nor by known, nor by characteristic, nor by an action, بِصِفَةٍ وَلَا فِعْلٍ, doesn't have a boundary, or the ghaya, nor a limit, or the muntaha, and cannot be perceived by the intellect. لا يدرك بالعقل. He is fully face, fully knowledge, fully hearing, seeing, fully light, fully power. Neither are two things in him, nor he is described by two different descriptions. لا يكون فيه شيئا ولا يوصف بوصفين مختلفين. This explanation recorded by Ibn Hanbal links Jahm ibn Ṣafwān ontology to his epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's premise is that God is neither corporeal, jismani, nor composite, or the murakkab. And from this he concludes that God cannot be described, la yusuf, because descriptions requires comparison or resemblance. God cannot be intellectually perceived, la yudrak bil aql, because perception involves distinguishing characteristics, and God has no distinct part or attributes. God is limitless and boundless, la hadda lahu wa la ghaya, since limits apply only to the things that have form or structure. And Jahm ibn Ṣafwān saw the attributes of God, such as face, knowledge, power, hearing, and sight, not as a separate qualities, but as an identical to God's essence. This means the statements like his fully knowledge, or huwa ilmun kullu, or his fully power, are not the description in usual sense, but rather expression of identity without actually telling us what God is. In Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's view, intellectual perception, or the idrak, requires the abstraction. One must separate an attribute from the thing it belongs to, like separating motion from moving body. But since God has no parts, la tarkiba lahu, or the separate attributes, he cannot be perceived by the intellect. And this is the key reason why Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's theology was heavily criticized by many Islamic scholars, including the Hanabalites, who saw his doctrine as denying God's attributes altogether. God cannot be described by characteristics or the sifat. Therefore, it is impossible to describe what he is. However, it is known by intuition that he is. Among the Jahamites are those who deny God all attributes. They argue God is not a thing, laysa bi shay, nor is he something of a thing, ma min shay, nor is he something which is in a thing, ma fi shay. Nor does the attribute or the sifat of a thing apply to him, nor the knowledge or the ma'rifah of a thing, nor the estimation of a thing. They argue that they know God only by intuition. They apply to him the name of Godhead, Ism al-Uluhiyya, but they do not describe him by any attribute which pertains to the Godhead. The Jahamites, as quoted by traditionalist Muhaddis Abu Hussein al-Malati, base their argument on the Aristotle theory of knowledge. Their reasoning follows a structure that to know what something is, one needs at least two terms that have the same reference but the different meanings. And this knowledge comes from abstracting characteristics from sensible things, or al-mahsusat, one of which is estimation. The process of abstraction involves comparing the multiple things or states that are either like or unlike each other. However, the Jahamites reject this process when speaking about God. They claim God is not a thing, laysa bi shay, so nothingness or the shay'iyah can be predicated of him. God is not of a thing, or ma min shay, so he doesn't belong to any category. God is not in a thing, or ma fi shay, so he is not an attribute of something else. Since God lacks all properties or characteristics, he is not the object of knowledge in the usual sense. When asked what is God, they respond, God's whatness or the mahiyya is simply the being God or al-uluhiyya. The name God refers to the Godhead. So the Jahmite conclude that there is no concept formation regarding God. However, they affirm that the demonstrative knowledge or al-ma'rifah al-burhaniyya of God's existence is possible. They argue that one knows that God exists in Allah mawjood through intuition, which occurs spontaneously. In Avicenna's or Ibn Sina's epistemology, intuition or al-hadith is the ability to find the middle term of a syllogism based on the experience. Similarly, the Jahamites claim that one arrives at the knowledge of God by realizing that all causation and change in the world must ultimately trace back to the first cause. All the attributes and verbs applied to God are identical in meaning and reference. Jahmites do not affirm with regard to God a face, not a property of hearing, not a property of seeing, not a property of knowing, not a property of speaking, not a property or a sifa, and they use the term his hearing or the sam, his seeing or the basar, his knowing, speaking with one and the same meaning, or bima'nan wahid. And the phrase not a property in their concept suggests that all the attributes or the sifats such as hearing, seeing, knowing and speaking are being rejected as distinct properties of God. Instead, the Jahamites argue that these terms or these attributes refer to God without implying real distinction in this sense. The key points in their argument is that the God is not a thing, laysa bi shay, to which a property can belong. Terms used to describe God, his knowledge, his power are both coextensive, identical in reference, and cointensive, identical in meaning. No predication of God is possible because all descriptions ultimately collapse into affirming nothing but his Godhead. This Jahmite theory of meaning closely resembles the doctrine of New-Arian theologian Eunomius of Cyzicus, who also denied that God's attributes had distinct meaning. This contrasts with the view of the Church Father, who allowed for negative predication. Some reports suggest that Jahm ibn Ṣafwān accepted the descriptions of God that no created thing can have. However, this doesn't mean that he affirmed the attributes in the usual sense. Rather, he allowed for the descriptions in language that refer to non-thingness, al-shay'iyyah, that which lies beyond the categories of the likeness and unlikeness, ashib wa adm ashib. So, for the Jahmite, even saying God is non-corporeal or the rejection doesn't mean that he possesses non-corporeality as a property. It simply indicates his transcendence beyond all categorization. God is the only cause of all things. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān said, in reality, no activity belongs to anything except God alone. He is the agent or the fa'il, whereas the activities or the fa'al of the humans are only metaphorically attributed to him, just as one says the tree moves, ash-shajaratu tatharrak, the celestial body moves in circle, the sun goes down, but it is God who exerts the effect upon the tree, celestial body and the sun. However, God creates for man a particular property, a particular potency by which the activity or the fail occurs, and he creates for him in each individual case a particular act of will and irada and a particular act of the choice to carry out the specific activity, just as he creates for him a particular length or the tool by which he is tall and a particular color by which he is colored. This account doesn't specify which kind of tropical speech is meant, but it appears to involve a metonymic inversion of agency and patiency. In figurative speech or the majaz, agency is attributed to the passive recipient of action, but in reality, the sensible compound or al-murakkab al-mahsus, whose movement is perceived, is merely an effect of God's agency. This is the moment described by the tree moves, is in fact God creating motion within the corporeal compound. And what applies to the movement or the haraka is the acts of will, choice, length and colors also applies to the Quran. Jahm ibn Ṣafwān used to say that Quran is a body, is a jism, and the effect or the fail of God. And he used to say the movement or the harakat are also the bodies, and there is no agent or the fa'il except God. And according to Jahm's theory of creation, every perceivable property of the corporeal world is caused anew or yuhdithu Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every instant of time fi kulli an. And this theory is reported in even greater detail from Dirar ibn Amr, which we will discuss in our coming episode. As we have seen, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's radical ontology not only rejected all corporeal or composite conceptions of God, but also denied that God is even a thing in any meaningful sense. For Jahamites, God's absolute transcendence means that he cannot be described, perceived, or predicated upon, not even metaphorically. And this led them to deny the legitimacy of attributes or the sifat, reducing divine description to affirmation of pure Godhead without any differentiation. And such a stance placed them in a direct conflict with the traditionalist theologians like Ibn Hanbal and ad-Darmi, who weave these negations as a form of heresy and a denial of the divine revelation itself. Yet, Jahm ibn Ṣafwān's weaves reflect a serious philosophical attempt to uphold God's absolute otherness using logic, abstraction and epistemology in the process.